Okay, let's go ahead and get started. This presentation is being recorded. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And let's go ahead and move through this. Dive on into FAFSA Simplification, the latest and greatest. So I'm Bridget McGuire. I am the Vice President of Operations for FA Solutions. I've been in financial aid for just shy of 30 years, working at a variety of schools from small to over 60,000, managing the financial aid processes. I enjoy finding efficient ways to process and explain financial aid and look forward to sharing information with you today. Joining me is Rachel Gordon. She's the COO of Educational Compliance Management. Rachel is a highly experienced enrollment management and financial aid professional with extensive experience in the creation of financial aid process flows, full cycle accreditation, implementation of automated systems, and staff training and development. Together, we hope to share the latest and greatest information. Quickly, I wanted to just let you know who we are. Both FA Solutions and ECM are companies that can provide a wealth of services related to financial aid processing, support services, including staffing and student call center services. And both of our companies offer extremely flexible, innovative solutions to help schools and students be successful. And we have some contact information in the end if you want to reach out to us after the presentation. So let's go ahead and dive into the agenda. We're going to talk about the reasons for these changes, the 24-25 changes related to federal work study, FAFSA, SAI, and Pell, the impact to students and schools, talk about a little bit of terminology, and then really want to allow time for the FAQ, for questions and answers. We found in some of our prior presentations that there wasn't enough time for questions. So you'll find that we move through some of the repetitive information that we talked about in our prior presentations. We'll go a little bit quicker so that we have time for questions and answers at the end. You're more than welcome to put your questions out there now in the Q&A option on the Zoom so that we can gather those up, and then we will allow time at the end to hopefully address as many questions as possible, is kind of our goal for this presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Rachel to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Bridget. So before we get started, it's really important to discuss the reasons for this change, and it really is regulatory. It started with the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, Public Law number 116-260, the Future Act, and of course, FAFSA Simplification Act, which we're all talking about and the reason that you're all here today. Following forward to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022, Public Law number 117-103, and FAFSA Simplification Technical Corrections Act. All of those acts are linked within the presentation that we will send you after we are completed today. Thank you. Sorry about that. Even we have technical issues at times. Now let's go through the history of what's going on in financial aid. We have been in a continual phase of change, as we all know. Let's go back to the year 21-22. We had the repeal of SULA, which was wonderful for us and our students. Then we had the removal of negative consequences associated with drug convictions or failure to register with the Selective Service. With these changes, we still had C codes showing up and comment codes on the ISARs. Fast forward to award year 22-23, they added comment codes on the student aid reports, updated to make it clear that although they removed the negative consequences, it still was a question showing up on our FAFSA. Going ahead to 23-24, it's really where we start to see the bulk of the changes. We finally had the removal of the drug conviction questions and selective service from the FAFSA. They have additions of additional demographic surveys asking our students questions about themselves, expansion of the Pell LEU restoration, extension of the Pell Grant eligibility to incarcerated students, carryover of responses to homeless and accompanied youth questions, changes to the cost of attendance, which really we did a deep dive in our last presentation. And if you'd like a link to that, we're happy to send that to you as well. Expansion of professional judgment, which again, we did a deep dive in our last presentation. adjustments for applicants who cannot provide parental information, expanded acceptable documentation for unaccompanied and homeless youth. And then we're looking forward to next year, award year 24-25, where we're really going to see a lot of change in how we review FAFSAs, how students complete them, and also the way in which we calculate financial aid overall. We have the modified FAFSA form, which includes the remaining FAFSA simplification provisions, including the provisional independent student determination, which is a big change for us. Provided tools for estimating student aid eligibility, expanded accessibility of the FAFSA form to the 11 most common languages, calculating of the student aid index, or SEI, which replaces our beloved EFC, or expected family contribution. Changes to the Pell Grant eligibility formula, changes to verification selection criteria, direct data exchange to import federal tax information, or the FTI, to the FAFSA, IDR, and TPD forms, which replaces our DRT, and the re-engineering of the FAFSA processing system. So a lot coming our way in the next award year. Starting in 24-25, we also have the collection of the federal work-study earnings in COD. These are going to be calendar year federal work-study earnings per student. And that's really important because it's not award year, it's calendar year specific. New student-based schemas are being built in Common Originations and Disbursements, or COD. Some people reference it as COD, to accommodate student-level reporting of the federal work-study data. Students will need to complete reporting for 2022 federal work-study earnings for the students prior to the release of the 24-25 FAFSA calendar year, not award year. FAFSA changes. The FAFSA will be shorter, but it will include submission consent. And we're going to get into that in a little bit with the parent wizard and how it's going to progress forward as students complete their FAFSAs. We're going to rely almost specifically on family tax data gathered through the FTI, which again replaces our DRT. A preference is student complete first and invite other contributors. Each person will complete their own section and require their own FSA ID. And with this, it's a time for you to reevaluate how you're currently meeting with students in your offices and your FAFSA completion processes. It's going to help identify who will be the parent. There will be a parent wizard, again, a new favorite term that we have. The parent is based on who provides more than 50% of the financial support to the student. This is not about who the student lives or resides with more than 50% of the time. It's about who's providing more than 50% of the financial support. Invitations will be sent to the parent for single parents or married filing jointly, second parent for married filing separately or other statuses, and the student's spouse. So again, this goes back to how we are going to be federal tax driven on our FAFSA. Other parties must log in using an FSA ID, provide answers to the questions, and give consent and sign the form. So our FSA ID is still remaining the same. We have a constant. Only once all parties have logged in and provided consent will information be sent for processing. If assets are needed and consent is split, assets will be asked for parent one only. There are going to be some new questions on the FAFSA. There's a breakdown of ethnic and racial questions, and you can see this on the FAFSA prototype. If you'd like the link, we're happy to send that to you. It's really helpful to go in it and see what it's going to look like and what the experience of our students will be. There's going to be questions about farm and small businesses, and these are going to play a lot larger part than they ever have in the past in the calculation of an EFC now that we're moving to the SAI. And they're also doubling the number of colleges that a student can send their FAFSA to from 10 to 20. So our undecided students can just send it all over and we can all review them and package them. Questions that they're removing from the FAFSA: voluntary parental information, any taxable income questions. Most of the untaxable income questions as well as housing questions. We know there's a lot of conversation around this, and I like to remind you that although they're not placing housing questions on the FAFSA, we do still have to capture this information. Lots of schools are going about different formatting, and Bridget will discuss this a little bit later in the presentation. But as a reminder, we cannot delay dispersing or processing of federal aid pending knowing the student's housing status. Number and family will drive from the tax return. There is the ability to override this. We have been informed by the department, but it will be originally driven by the tax form. In-kind support is no longer reported. Other changes. Household size pulls from the tax information, as I stated a moment ago, but it can be updated. Unborn children cannot be counted in the household size. That is for sure a change for us. And as we're all very well aware, the FAFSA won't be available until December 2023, as it's not out in October. We've already seen the prototypes, and again, we can send you the links for those. And we don't know when in December, beginning, middle, end. They have not been specific as to the date as of yet. And confirmation page will still show the student aid index, which will replace the EFC.
Okay, and speaking of the student aid index replacing the EFC, let's move on to those changes. And just want to reiterate some of this information if you attended earlier presentations this year, we've covered. So we're hitting on the high points or any information that has been shared recently or clarified from the department. So some of the slides are similar, but we know not everybody attended all the presentations. So we want to try to get a little bit of information in there for everybody that could be new or has visited our prior presentations. So the student aid index. It is replacing the EFC. So there is no longer a student, an EFC, expected family contribution. It's the SAI. The thought is that the SAI more clearly defines a student's eligibility, whereas the EFC, a lot of families thought that was how much they needed to pay, and it confused them. So using a totally different terminology that's calculated differently hopefully leads to clarity, which is the whole purpose behind FAFSA simplification. But the SAI is not going to be the leading indicator for if a student is Pell eligible. Right now, you know, if they're a 0 EFC and no prior bachelor's degree, they're in an undergraduate program, they're going to be eligible for Pell. Now, you can't look at just the SAI alone. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what still stays the same, similar to the EFC formula, all three versions for SAI are still there. Dependent students, independence without dependence, and independence with dependence. The calculation still relies upon income and asset information. If you're a dependent student, there's still a parent contribution and there's still a student contribution. And there's still worksheets and tables. They're just completely different worksheet and tables. There is no longer the Pell calculation spreadsheet. Instead, we're going to rely on a different spreadsheet. And then there's a potential for a negative SAI. So before the EFC would end at 0, there was no negative figures. Now you can have all the way down to a negative 1,500 to describe who your neediest students are. So those are the biggest changes. Calculating Pell, like I said, is different. It's not just what's the SAI. Instead, it's based on poverty guidelines. And so it is going to be based on the tax year associated with that FAFSA. So for 24-25, it's going to use the 2022 poverty guideline chart, which we do have a link to in our reference page. There are 3 different poverty guideline charts, one for the contiguous 48 states, one for Hawaii, and one for Alaska. So depending on where your student or school is located, you want to take that into consideration. And then there's going to be 3 types of Pell. There's the calculated maximum Pell, which is going to use the AGI and the number and household. There's the calculated minimum Pell that is going to be using the AGI and a multiplier. And then there's a calculated Pell, or actually calculating it using the SAI and the maximum Pell value in that calculation to determine how much Pell a student might be eligible for. And that could still result in a 0 Pell eligibility. So just because you're calculating a Pell does not mean that the student will necessarily be Pell eligible. So as an example, I just visually wanted to show it to you. This presentation is not meant to do a deep dive into how to do the calculation. We did that in an earlier presentation, and we're happy to assist schools as needed. But I just wanted to visually show it because, as mentioned, we really wanted to make sure that we had time for questions and answers. So the top chart is an example of the 48 states contiguous poverty guideline chart. It's just a sample of it. This chart only goes up to 225% of the poverty percentage, when in reality, the chart goes all the way up to 400%. So it's just a sample. And then down the left-hand side, you have the number in household. And so really what the calculation is doing for Pell eligibility is you're looking at how many people are in the household and where does that income fall on the poverty guideline? And does it fall in a range that qualifies them for maximum, minimum, or a calculated Pell value? The bottom chart gives kind of a visual example of based on if you're a dependent, single parent or not single parent, and an independent with dependents or not, and then single or not as a parent, and where you fall in the chart. So if we took an example of, say, a dependent student that had parents, both parents married, 4 in the household, and let's say their income was 48,000, they would fall just under this 175% poverty guideline. We looked at our visual example, not a single parent, under 175, they actually qualify for eligible Pell. So it's just a visual to show you that it's totally based on the income and the number in household relative to the poverty chart will determine how much Pell eligibility a student may receive. Now, NASFA does have an excellent modeling tool that you can run your data through to see kind of how your students change year over year. Is something that I suggest, but you could also just visually kind of map where you think the majority of your students fall, to also kind of understand where the change is. The change is supposed to produce more Pell eligible students. There is a change to how part-time Pell works. So first you determine how much a student qualifies for. Are they minimum? Are they maximum? Are they calculated? But then Pell amounts are going to be determined by enrollment intensity, which is a new terminology for 24-25. It's no longer an enrollment status, it's enrollment intensity. And enrollment intensity is determined by the number of credits that a student is attending for that payment period. Full-time is defined as 12 credits. And clock hour is always defined as full-time. I think we had that question quite a bit the last time we did the presentation. So 12 credits is full-time. So how many credits is the student taking within that? And in this example, we assumed 3,200 as the Pell eligibility figure, just a random figure we used in the example. So if a student's taking 11 credits, you would take the Pell eligibility times 11 divided by 12 for full-time, and you would get what the student is eligible for. So in that example, $2,933. And it goes all the way down to 1 credit. So even in our old language, enrollment status of less than half time, and our new language, enrollment intensity, even 1 credit potentially could be eligible for Pell. So there's no longer like the year-round Pell or the summer Pell. It really is based on their enrollment intensity. And what is that calculation based on the number of credits in the payment period, based on 12 being full-time. So no longer minimum half-time requirement, even 1 credit gets Pell. I already mentioned that clock hour is processed as a full-time capability. And 12 is full-time. So even if your school defines it as 15 credits is full-time, 12 is what's used in the calculation. So again, wanted to allow time for questions because we know this is where some of the confusing area goes. So we didn't do a ton of examples so that we would have more time to answer questions. You're welcome to be posting your questions in the Q&A as they pop up in your head and we go through the presentation. So as mentioned, the impact to students is that the Department of Ed anticipates that more students are going to be eligible for Pell, and at a higher dollar figure than they currently are. There are two categories that perhaps could be negatively impacted. Multiple family members in college, as Rachel mentioned, that's no longer a factor in determining an SAI. And so that's something schools might want to think about is how many students do you have that have multiple siblings in college? Do you do anything different for them in the upcoming year? Do you do a professional judgment? Do you have some of the different extra awarding dollars if it massively changes their eligibility? You might want to think about what's your student population look like, and every school kind of has a little unique factor when it comes to that. But if they were getting Pell eligible before because of multiple family members, that may impact them and they might not be Pell eligible now. And then families with farms and small businesses, as mentioned, that's a new calculation. And the modeling tools at the moment don't factor that in because that data wasn't collected before. So there's not a way to factor that in. And so we don't know what really that impact is going to be yet. So you'll want to think about, where's your school located? Where are your students located? Could this be a big impact as well? And what, again, type of dollars might you have available for some of those students that maybe are in their final year and we're getting Pell all along, and now because of a small business or farm income, maybe they don't. So do you do something for them that final year, or do some sort of a professional judgment, or have some sort of additional dollars to assist those students? But most students are going to receive generally the same amount or more in Pell, is our understanding. Put together, I know it's a lot of words on the page, but I wanted to at least just call attention to some of the terminology changes. We do have a link in our references. The Department of Education has sent out an announcement that has the same terminology changes in it. Just visually wanted to kind of put them into a chart that maybe helps people think differently about the terminology change. So we added what the new terminology is, and then a column that talks about what we think the short name will be. You'll see in some of them there's a question mark. I don't know if it's an official yet acronym, but we know financial aid folks love their acronyms. And so it's testing out a few of those. I'm not sure what they really will wind up being. And then if there was a prior name that was similar. And then the definition, and the definition was taken from the Department of Ed's page of their terminology, just to kind of describe some of these changes, and wanted to highlight a few of them again. So FSA ID is now, it's the account username and password. It's just more defined as to what it is. As Rachel mentioned, there are now contributors when filling out the FAFSA. So that is definitely new language. Who are the contributors? Whose income needs to be included in the FAFSA? Those people are called contributors, and they do have to consent to sharing their tax information in order for the FAFSA to be calculated. Federal tax information is the FTI. The FAFSA submission summary report, that's what used to be called the student aid report, or the SAR, is now going to be called the FAFSA submission summary report. Family size replaces household size. So it's now family size instead of household. The FPS C flag replaces C codes or SAR C codes. Student aid index replaces the EFC. We already talked about that. Primary or custodial parent, right? That's the new definition of who is the parent of record to fill out the FAFSA. The parent that provides 50% income, not who you lived with, who provided the financial resources. So that's why it's the primary or custodial parent. We talked about in our much earlier presentations this year about all the cost of attendance changes, because those were implemented for 23-24, but room and board is now called food and housing. Other financial assistance, OFA, replaces the EFA. Just talked about enrollment intensity instead of enrollment status. Then we have the new terminology for maximum Pell eligibility, minimum Pell eligibility, or the student aid index calculated Pell eligibility. The FAFSA partner portal is going to change, and that actually is being called FPP. It replaces FAA access to CPS. The FAFSA processing system that we're used to calling CPS is now going to be called FPS. And then the Future Act data exchange, I just mentioned that briefly because it replaces the DRT. So the whole purpose of FAFSA simplification does allow that tax information to come directly from the IRS through the Future Act data exchange, which is the reason you have the contributors and they have to provide that consent in order to release their tax information. So this by all means is not all of the terminology changes, but I wanted to touch on the ones that I thought were probably the most impactful, or things that at least we here in our office discussed the most, and share that information. And then I did put the reference slides in here. So again, I mentioned the key terms and definitions. It is updated for the draft, the FAFSA draft specification guide that came out just last week. So if you didn't see that on FSA Partners, we do have the link in this presentation as well, along with links to the poverty guidelines and other various charts that either our material came from, or I think are just high level documents worth reviewing as we prepare for the 24-25 changes. And so as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, what we really wanted to make sure we did today was have time to answer questions, because there hasn't been a lot of new information shared over the last few months. I know we called it latest and greatest because as we were building it, you don't know when we're going to get new information, right, over the last few months. But what we're finding is a lot of it just is people's questions that need to be answered. So I probably should have titled it question and answer session, but we were optimistic there might be some more information to share that changed between when we did the presentation in the summer to the fall presentation. So appreciate you all sticking with us. So let's dive into some of these questions and see what we have. Okay. And see, you haven't disappointed. Lots of questions. Is the data retrieval tool now mandatory? Well, it is not called the data retrieval tool any longer. It's going to be that tax exchange of information, and it is mandatory. That is where the consent comes in. So for anybody that's a contributor, anybody that filed a tax return that is going to be on the FAFSA, so student and spouse, or parent, or remarried parent, or currently married parents, or parents that are separated and filed separate, anybody whose tax information would need to be included does have to consent and provide that information in order for it to come through. Rachel, anything else you want to add?
No, this is also where that parent wizard comes in, where it's going to send invitations to the various contributors, i.e. parent 1, parent 2, or possibly spouse.
Okay, next one. How are we supposed to know which parent supports the student more than 50% versus the old question that asked who the student lived with more than 50%, lived with more than 50%? It is true, it has changed. So it is now who provides financially more support. And as Rachel mentioned, there are a few questions on the FAFSA that kind of help determine that, but hopefully the household knows who financially is contributing more to the family, and that would be who completes the FAFSA. If parents are separated or divorced, does the second parent need to complete anything? They would not. So it's whatever parent is financially the most financially supportive of that student would be the parent that would fill out the FAFSA. Now, if that parent's remarried, their spouse would need to fill it out as well. But it is if the parents are divorced, whichever parent is providing the most financial support for that student. 50% of student support. It used to be that the FAFSA considered whoever the student lived with was providing at least 50% support. So is that totally gone? And how is the 50% of greater going to be determined? So it is totally gone. The new FAFSA is totally based on income and who that parent is. And how is it determined? I think that's more the student and the parents completing it and making that determination. There's not, like, it doesn't look at both taxes and determines. The family itself has to determine who is the bigger financial contributor, and that's who fills it out. Any discussions to come on the loss of siblings in college? I did touch on that briefly, that, it's definitely not going to be a question on the FAFSA, and it's definitely not factored into the SAI calculation. So as a student, as a school, that is something that you might want to go back and review, and either look at maybe prior years FAFSA data, or if you know who your students are that had multiple siblings in college and run the modeling tool for your school, you could see at how those students, SAI comes out in the modeling tool, and then make a determination. I think some schools have talked about potentially professional judgments for those. Some have talked about potentially additional scholarship dollars if they're no longer qualified. But at some point, you have to kind of draw that line and start using the SAI, but thinking more, not for so much your brand new students coming in, but like your juniors or your seniors, right? If it impacts their Pell eligibility to finish their program, you might want to think about how you could help them financially for that change in number in household, either professional judgments or something like that.
May I add to that, Bridget?
Absolutely.
This FAFSA Simplification Act also revised the Higher Education Act to include any family members enrolled in post-secondary education in the list of circumstances that we might consider when deciding whether to use professional judgment. So if you take a look at the information put out by the department, they have now included that in the options that we can utilize for professional judgment. And as a reminder, you need to review those on a case-by-case basis.
Yep. Similarly related, but are there recommendations for schools to follow in regards to collecting a current student's housing status? So we've heard from a bunch of different institutions what they're doing. So some institutions already collect that information through like their admissions applications or their admissions process. So they're using that data. Some schools have chosen for all of their continuing students to assume the same status that was used in years before, while they figure out a longer term solution. And then if it turns out it's not the same, to make an adjustment at the time they learn it's different. You can ask students for it, but what you can't do is delay awarding financial aid because you don't have that information. So you will want to make some sort of determination, and I would say look at your current or previous years. What percentage of your students are on campus, or do you even offer on-campus housing, or what percentage are off campus with parents? Look at your population and kind of make some assumptions on what would be make the most sense. And then you can always go back and make changes if the student raises their hand and says, hey, it's completely different. Or nope, I moved off campus, or have a process for the student, to come in and let you know if it's changed. Maybe add something to your award offer that says, this is based on you living here. If different, let us know. So I think the whole financial aid community prefers that question had still remained where it was, but it's not there. So we've got to find a workaround. I don't know, Rachel, have you heard any different workarounds that I didn't mention?
No, I have not. The most common seems to be, from what I'm hearing from our schools, is utilization of a application to find out that information, possibly for new students during the time which they're applying to the school, and continuing through different processes.
Okay. Since all parties have to log in and consent for the information to be processed, how do we process when a student has a parent that will not complete? So if this is a case where maybe they're going to wind up being a professional judgment for like an independent versus a dependent student, something like that, there is a provisional independent process within the new FAFSA that might address that. But if they don't qualify for like a dependency override or something like that, and they truly are dependent and live with parents and parents just aren't filling it out, I think that's going to have to be a question to explain to them why the necessity, much like now when some parents don't want to fill out the FAFSA, but that's the IRS data is needed in this new FAFSA world. And it's just going to be a change, I guess. Wish I had a better answer there. And there is a process. I don't know if that's a question in here because we've gotten the question a lot. If it's an undocumented parent or a parent that doesn't have a social security number, and sometimes that's why they don't want to provide the information, there is a process within the FAFSA when they're applying for an FSA ID, and then within the FAFSA to answer the questions that they don't have a social security number. And there's a process where it still validates who they are, and it still does bounce to ensure that there's no tax information out there. And so that's part of the reason, right? Even non-tax filers are still going to bounce to the IRS to confirm that there's no tax information out there. And so they still have to go through that process to confirm that it doesn't exist. And there is also a process, if they say they had foreign income, they can then enter the foreign income as well. So we'll see if we get to those questions, but it's probably worth sharing that. Okay. If the student has a minimum Pell flag set to Y and you calculate Pell is greater than minimum Pell, do we award minimum Pell or the calculated Pell? Or if the minimum Pell flag equals Y, we just award minimum Pell and not calculate one? I'm reading through that question again. So I think what you're saying is if automatically their minimum Pell, yes, do you just award minimum Pell, or should you double check to make sure that they don't qualify for some other type of figure? As I understand it right now, it would award minimum Pell because it will let you know whether it's minimum, maximum, or calculated. So my understanding is minimum would receive minimum. Rachel, anything different on that?
No, that's my understanding as well.
What is the purpose of a negative SAI if it is all zero from 0 to the 1500? The negative SAI is going to come into play when you're doing the calculated Pell, and when you're looking, well, no, it's still 0 when you're doing your cost of attendance minus OFA. So it's really in the calculated Pell figure. And I think it's just another determination for the department to say, these are now your neediest students. So they have made an extra level of neediness instead of everybody just being 0. I don't know if I have a better definition of that, but I'll have to do some research and see if I can give you a more educated answer. Income on 2022 poverty guideline chart. Is the income AGI gross or net? My understanding is it's AGI.
It is. If you pull up the poverty charts, it does specifically state that it is based on the AGI.
That's what I thought. Like I said, this is new for everybody, right? Like we didn't go to an extra fancy FAFSA simplification school, but we have attended a lot of presentations and read the regulations and the documents released from the Department of Education, but it is all still new. So I don't want you, to feel like we're, doing this on the fly, but it is all still new for all of us. I don't know, other than people that work at the Department of Ed, if there's truly one expert out there yet, because you guys come up with really good questions for your unique situations at your school. And we're still making sure that we fully understand how everything works. Which is good. We've got time before it's officially 24-25. And I feel like we have a strong handle on it. There are just some things that are still, taking a moment to either remember or dig up on the fly as you guys are posting these questions. Is it possible to get a copy of the webinar that covered the Pell calculation? Or how can we connect with you? Yes. In fact, I'll just put this slide up there so that you have it. But yeah, if you want prior information from us or some of the prior webinars that we referenced, we did a cost of attendance, we did a professional judgment, we did an initial FAFSA changes, and we did a Pell calculation that had more detailed examples in it. You're welcome to reach out to us. We're happy here to support the financial aid community, so just let us know. A question again that just asked about AGI on the poverty chart, so we already covered that. How are larger schools approaching packaging students? Will they attempt to try and provide awards before the FAFSA is released? We're getting pressure from your administration, from admissions and early decision, and wondered how others were handling this. So all of our schools at the moment are waiting. Any of the schools, I think for you too, right? Rachel, for ECM?
100%.
Yeah, I think so. The schools that we work with, so that's about 200 or so across the country. But I have seen this posted many times on some of the listservs and some of the, financial aid and social media pages. And my impression is nobody that actually works in financial aid wants to do them ahead of time.
No.
And so the financial aid community is trying to band together and say, wait till you have the output of the FAFSA. But I get that admissions organizations and enrollment organizations want us to try to do something earlier. I say it's super new, and you're going to be doing a lot of extra work. And there's still information coming out from the department. So, I don't know how you could even calculate it earlier when, you'd be doing a lot of manual hand calcs, and especially if you're a larger school, it would not be my preference. And it doesn't appear to be the preference of the financial aid community, but I haven't heard of any of large schools trying to do it ahead of time. And I actually have a senior going into school that just did all her applications. And, so far we haven't heard from any schools, and she's applied to some large ones. And we haven't heard from any of them yet that they're going to be giving us any. In fact, a lot of them pushed their deadlines back as well. And only one school had early decision of the ones that she applied, when in prior years, they all had earlier decisions, knowing from my other children. I don't know if that helps you. That's more subjective than official. Okay, would half credits also be calculated? So would we use 11.5 or 11?
Yes.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, no, sorry. We would use the 11.5 when we're looking at the enrollment intensity. We would end up utilizing decimal points in this calculation. So for example, if we're looking at it and it would be 7.5 credits, we would use 7.5 credits. Same if it was 10.5, and they would incorporate that into the equation. So it'd be 7.5 divided by 12 times 100 to give you the percentage.
Yeah. And so I think that was the next question also, is how do you account for 5.5? So yes, you use the decimal points. Okay. Can you clarify, is there one poverty chart for the 48 states, or does each state? There's one for the 48 states, there's one for Alaska, and there's one for Hawaii. So 3 total options for the poverty chart. Okay. So regardless of the semester they are enrolled, a student could receive Pell Grant if they are eligible. That is correct, based on enrollment intensity and eligibility. Now, I say that not knowing exactly which Pell formula your school is using or how you're structured, but that is correct. It's based on enrollment intensity now. And not like summer had to be at least half time. That is probably the way to phrase that statement without really knowing what your school structure is. Do you only calculate enrollment intensity if the student is only eligible for calculated Pell, or would you look at enrollment intensity for minimum and maximum as well? Yes, for any of the Pell statuses. So the maximum, the minimum, and the calculator tell you, like, the use the word maximum again, and that's not right, tell you the total that they could receive. But then that total is going to be adjusted based on their enrollment intensity. So maximum, minimum, and calculated is if they were full-time, right? But if their enrollment intensity is something less than 12 credits, then you do the calculation to determine how much of that total max, total min, total calculated that they get. Are credits for enrollment intensity based on whole? We already talked about whole numbers. We said yes, decimals are counted. How would 12 credit hours for full-time for a semester school be converted to a quarter school that uses lower credit hour to be considered full-time? I will have to go back and look at that, but it's my understanding 12 is always full-time, So if your full-time is a lower figure, your students are going to be qualifying for a lower Pell dollar figure. We'll double check that, but, and if you want to put your name in the chat or reach out directly and say that was your question, but, and I don't know, Rachel, if you know, but that's my understanding is that 12 is full-time. So if you've decided 8 is full-time for your institution, your enrollment intensity calculation would be reducing their Pell.
Based on everything that I have read and seen, exactly the same.
And most schools, when I see that you use a different definition for full-time, is usually for your graduate programs, and they're not Pell eligible anyways. So I don't know if maybe that ties together. That's my first kind of thought when I see someone use less. It's usually because it's a graduate program. And they don't get Pell. For a single mother who is the main provider of a student, is the other parent's info and income required? If they are a single parent, I'm going to say no if they're common law married, or if they're, but you're saying single parent. So single parent, it's just that parent and providing it. There are very specific answers in the FSA presentations. There was a very specific question about child support paid and which parent, if the parent is paying child support. So really that's what the other parent is using as their total income is the child support paid. It's the parent paying the child support that's doing the 51%. And there's a good example in the FSA transcript that may help if that's more where your question is going.
And we can send you the link to that if you would like.
The independent versus dependent questions will stay the same to determine the student's status. Correct. Yes. Those did not change. Do you know if a student's parents are divorced? Oh, this question just came out. There you go. You just asked that. Child support received to the parent the student lives with. That's the only income. Yes, there is a very specific question, and I meant to open it up because I was positive we would get this, and I just didn't have a moment. But yes, it's the parent paying the child support because that's the financial that's where the financial support is mostly coming from. So it becomes that parent. And that's probably one of the biggest differences, right? Because it's not who you live with anymore. Is the FADDX instantaneous so a student and contributor will know immediately if the information could be imported, or do they have to follow a manual track? It's my impression, but I don't know if I've seen it in writing that it happens right then. Because then it moves to the very next question that will ask you if your number and household is different from what was on your tax information. So I believe it's instantaneous. I'll see if I can find an answer to that though, because I don't think I've actually seen that in writing, but I feel like that's what they are describing. Okay, what if the household does not file taxes? So they still do that consent process, and it bounces to the IRS and confirms that there's not a tax return filed, and just confirms that they're a non-tax filer in that regard. So they still go through that same process. Everybody needs an FSA ID that's a contributor. Everybody needs to consent, and they go through that process. I have used the draft SAI supplemental case scenario and compared that to the online calculator and did a hand calc using the draft. I'm impressed with you. Using the draft Pell eligibility and SAI guide, and it came up with 3 different results. Well, I have not seen that yet, and I am impressed. I don't have the answer to that, but we would be happy to post it to the department and see what kind of answer we can get back. That's an excellent question and very impressive. Make a note of that because we'll post that one. And I don't think, I know I have not done the same for the same student. So that's actually a really good idea that we'll go back and do as well. That's a great suggestion. Okay. Oh, hold on, it's not scrolling down. Hold on. There we go. If both parents are not financially contributing to the child, like in a case where the entire family, or just the students are living with grandparents, Or in the case of a student that moved out and self-supports, who do they choose? Interesting question. So if they don't qualify for a professional judgment, right, because they have a relationship with their parents and there's no unusual circumstance with it, they just happen to live with grandparents, or they just happen to be a very independent, self-supporting child. I don't know. I mean, I guess they'd have to just make a decision. Like, I don't know, who gives them more birthday money? I don't know how you'd make that determination. I think that's another probably good question that we, have to work through the example and really think about who's really supporting. I guess I would say which parents, grandparents are they living with, and maybe use that parent. And in all reality, in these cases you mentioned, it wouldn't matter if they're living with the grandparents, because they probably have low income then, right? And so they're probably going to be eligible regardless. So I guess it would depend on, are those parents both married and living with the grandparents? Are the parents separated? Yeah, I think there'd just be a lot of different scenarios that you'd have to work through to help them determine who's the correct parent. What about the students whose parent does not have a social security number? It will, the new FSA process will allow a student with no social security number to create an account. It asks them subsequent questions to help determine who they are. And then it will allow them to have an FSA ID to move through the process. Okay. And we only have a few more minutes, and you guys just started firing off a bunch of questions. Goodness. And I thought we allowed a lot of time for questions. If they are married, filed joint, does only one parent have to fill out through the parent wizard, or do both? Correct. If you're married and filed joint, only one parent has to do it. Will the Pell Award be listed along with the SAI on the confirmation page? Rachel, I think you looked that one up before, right?
I believe that it is going to be there based on what we saw as of today.
That's what I thought. Okay. If parents are separated and divorced and the parent is not living in the household, provides child support, up the similar question to what we answered before. It's the parent paying the most amount of money. So child support counts as the parent paying money. So which one then has the most income? If they both have income, then I would say which income is the parent providing the child support plus income more than the parent receiving the child support. Separate parents, are separate parents just those who live separately? Usually it's a legal separation. So, they're formally separated and potentially on their way to like a formal divorce is usually how I've seen separate defined. And not just maybe if somebody's, for work living in a different location, but they're still, happily married and together. They're just living separate because of maybe work, versus separate because they are not together, is what I would define separate as. Is there a handout or guide sheet that we can give out prior to FAFSA night that students can determine contributors? I haven't seen one, but I know on a lot of the financial aid listservs and social media pages, people have asked what other what other folks have put together and have been kind of sharing information. So if we see something, we're happy to help folks or look it over and see if it's something that may work. We have not personally yet as a company developed anything like that. And I think that's where the department is still kind of working on some of those tools that might be available for when the FAFSA does come out, but I haven't seen it at all. Will these changes affect verification? Not at all. Verification remains exactly the same. Sub, unsub award, like there's no change there. So verification is still going to exist, V1, V4, V5. Our hope is that there's less V1 and V5 because of the new tax process, but we'll see. Since SAI isn't going to be prorated, how will summer awards be affected in the change of enrollment? So that is a true statement. SAI is one figure. So where you had the EFC, you had like a 3-month budget and a 6-month budget and a 9-month budget. SAI is one figure. So it does come into play when you're calculating eligibility. So a student that maybe is only there one term could have a different calculated figure because the SAI is not prorated. SAI is a set term. Does the parent determination tool deal with guardianship situations? I don't know that answer. Rachel, do you know that answer?
No, I do not as of yet.
But guardian doesn't count as a parent, so I would assume when you're answering the dependency question about, your award of a court or a legal guardian, you would be skipping the parent section anyways, because you already answered that you're like a ward of a court or have a legal guardian. So legal guardians don't provide income information on the FAFSA. If that, I guess, helps answer the question. If a dependent student's parents are married, however, they filed their tax return incorrectly, example, had a household and single, will they be prompted to manually enter their tax information? I have not reviewed like what kind of rejects the system will put out yet. So I think you're saying, yeah, they filed separate returns, so they will both have to be contributors and both put in their information. So one's going to say had a household and one's going to say single. I will assume that will give us some sort of a comment code. But I haven't seen that specifically. Okay. If the parent marital status of the contributor changed from their tax filing status, and then subsequently they were separated, divorced at the time of the FAFSA, will the IRS provide the married filing jointly income and then we do a PJ to separate the income? Or will the FADDX not be available and the contributor will need to enter income manually? So if they filed jointly at the time, it's only going to ask for one parent to approve it. It will bring over all of the income. But then they have a new parent. I'm sure this is one of the answers or one of the questions that's been asked of FSA. I don't know if I've seen a specific answer. Rachel, have you?
I have, and this is going to be one of those instances, as in the past, where we have to utilize our professional judgment
And separate out the income and
yes,
fix everything. Okay, when we have a FAFSA of a provisionally independent student and determine that they should be dependent, what would we update on the FAFSA to correct that? And then would it reject and we would not receive the update until the parent completes their part? The parent would have to complete their part. I don't know if I don't have an exact answer on what would be updated. Do you know, Rachel?
They would have to sign the FAFSA as one portion. So they'd have to actually log in, sign with their FSA ID, and then we can process forwards because we would need to have a valid FAFSA. And we can ask them to go back and connect their tax information, or of course we have the manual ability to add information if needed.
All right. What information needs to be provided about farms and small businesses? That is in the FAFSA prototype, I believe. I don't know that off the top of my head. We'll have to give that back in our FAQ written answers. What will happen if the student, spouse, and or parent did not file a tax return, but according to income required, they were required to file? I'm assuming that's also going to be a common code, but Rachel, do you know?
No, I do not as of yet.
All right. Can you provide the link where the higher ed mentions that we can add the number of siblings in college as a PJ option? Yeah, I don't know if it's a specific language because the PJ is up to the school, right? The department doesn't define what a PJ could be, right? They have very loose guidelines, which we like as financial aid professionals, that as long as we have supportive documentation, we can make that decision. But I think there's some sort of a question out there.
And you can absolutely find it. It's also in Gen 2311, but we will send you the link to that, which is some of the FAFSA Simplification Act Q&As that came to the department.
If information on the if confirmation of tax information is required, will the FAFSA still come in as rejected for a parent refusal, or will it not allow the student to complete the FAFSA at all? or that's when the provisional independent questions come in?
Well, there's two options here that might come into play. One, they have the option to apply specifically only for the unsub, or this could be the provisional independence, where then it has to be reviewed in the FAA office for determination.
All right, well, we are at time. And I'm scrolling through, there's a few questions that ask again about the poverty charts that we already mentioned. When the FAFSA will be released, we don't know the answer to that question. And so, oh, there's lots more. See, I'm still scrolling. So we'll put together an FAQ with the questions that we got with typed answers and get that sent out to the attendees of the presentation. I'll say in the next week or so. Some of it, might still be from the last one where we said, still waiting on an answer from Ed for a few of these, but appreciate you all joining today. We hope to continue doing more webinars as we all get more comfortable with the information and learn more. If there are other topics not related to FAFSA simplification or related to it that you would like to hear us talk about, or attend presentations on, feel free to pass on ideas. We're happy to help. And if in general you need help with your financial aid office because of an open position or because of the volume of FAFSAs that will be coming in next year after January 1st, feel free to reach out to us as well. But very happy that you joined today. I appreciate your participation. I knew we'd get questions, but my goodness, not quite so many. So I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. But have an excellent afternoon and be on the lookout for a recap of the FAQ.